All
right, so pump testing, this is the method I was taught by Gary Moorhead. It's the same as the Femper test, only it's multiple readings on it, and it can be done several different ways. I like to use an adjustable barrel nozzle that has several settings. This one has 4 settings, one at 30 gallons a minute, one at 60 gallons a minute, one at 95 gallons a minute, and then one at 125 gallons a minute. When you use a nozzle like this, it also has adjustments for a straight stream or a fog. I like to use a straight stream because it keeps me from getting too wet. That's really the only reason. Keep in mind that you are going to be shooting water quite a ways. Not as much with the old Type 6, but it's going to reach out there quite a ways. So know what you're going to run into with water. So what we will do is we'll fire it up, we'll run it at max RPM, and then we'll flow water out of this. We'll do it fairly quickly, and we will take residual readings of the pressure. We've already determined that this is equal to nozzle pressure. This is my discharge pressure. It's equal to nozzle pressure, so we'll flow water at the 30 gallon a minute mark. We'll read the residual pressure here. Then we will change this over to the 60 gallon a minute mark. We'll read the residual pressure there, and then so on with 95 and 125. There's a flush mode on this, but we don't know what that's rated at. So I don't even do it. It's kind of a 2-person job. So one person's going to operate this. That'll be me because I just happen to be on this side. And I will have Josh here assist me in reading the residual pressures. We'll yell back and forth at each other. I'll yell at you what setting I'm on. So on the board there, you want to make a mark for 30, 60, 95, and 125. And then we'll take the reading, you'll write down the pressure next to that, and when it's all said and done, we'll do the calculations to figure out what the volume was at those settings. So let me see your, okay. So, perfect. One thing to remember is this is the setting on the nozzle. It's not actually the volume that's going through the nozzle. It would be the volume if the nozzle pressure is 100, because this nozzle is rated at 100 PSI. So at 100 PSI, I'm gonna get 30, 60, 95, and 125. And having tested it, so our sheet says 30, 60, 95, and 125 happens to be what this nozzle is set at. I just erased the GPM part because while that is the GPM setting, all it is to us at this point is a setting. They should come out with different numbers based on whatever our residual pressure is, whatever our residual nozzle pressure is. And we will calculate what it can do. So 4 sets, if you don't have a super nice, shiny, big, giant, huge nozzle like this to do this kind of project with. Okay, so the question came up. What was the question again? It was, I'm gonna see what pressure I get 30 gallons a minute at, and that's not what we're doing. So what we're gonna do is we're gonna run the pump at max RPM. So max RPM is the maximum amount of water that'll flow out of it. Okay, so if you take all this off and get rid of it, you should have close to 0. If you took all of the piping and everything off and just blasted it right off the side of the pump itself, you would have 0 PSI. You have 0 pressure, and you'd have maximum volume that it can move. So that's what the pump does. It spins and it moves volume. You start to restrict that flow, you know, put some pipes in there, put a nozzle in here, especially the nozzle, since I can actually shut it off all the way. That restricts the flow. That creates pressure in the system. So what I'm looking to do is figure out how much pressure my pump can build at any given volume that's out there. Can I calculate it out to set it up to do a specific volume? I can, but not until you really get to know your pump quite well. What we're gonna do here is we're gonna run at maximum RPM, the most water it can flow, and we're gonna see what kind of pressure it builds at whatever flow it flows. We can calculate what that flow is, but we do that after we do the test, at the end of the test. So we're going to have it at a 30 gallon a minute setting, and it's going to do 250. It's going to do 250 psi probably, maybe a little less than that, but it's going to do a whole bunch of pressure. So at 250 psi, this 30 gallon a minute setting is moving more than 30 gallons a minute. The nozzle's rated at 100. So everything over 100 is actually more volume. And that's what we use the calculator to figure out. So you can do it with math too, but that's harder. That math's built into the calculator, it's really simple. So when I'm at 60 gallons a minute, my pressure is going to drop. And I'm at the 60 gallon a minute setting, my pressure is going to drop from 250 or whatever it's at. It'll be less pressure, but it'll still be more than 60 gallons a minute. That makes sense? All right. So, what if you don't have a really nice nozzle like this? I'm glad we did this right next to the road. There's shade. So you don't have a nice nozzle like this with all these adjustable settings. What can you do? You can actually build one of these guys. Couple gated wires stuck together with some 3/8 tips on them. So I have 30, 60, 90, and 120 using that apparatus. You would open them one at a time. Of course, I would need the other piece on here. I don't know where to put it. So you open one, you got 30. You open the next one, you got 60. Flowing 3, you got 90, etc. Can I do this pump test? We'll get to that later. All right, I think we're ready to go. We lost our scribe. Move that out of the way. Oh, there it is. That's okay. If we have time, we'll do one with this too. All right, I'm gonna fire it up and I'll run the nozzle. So you're gonna need to stand in here and read the residual pressure after we get it going. Yeah, we just put it under pretty heavy load, so we'll give it a second to cool off. Good, I was wondering where you came up with some of those numbers, but okay.
So that was with it closed.
Yeah, so the 390, when it was moving no water, that's your shutoff pressure. Yeah, that's the most pressure it can make moving 0 gallons a minute. You're never going to get over 390, and really at 390 you're not moving any water anymore. So that's one end of the performance curve for the pump. All right, so the next step, do we have a ballpoint pen? perfect. The next step, because I'm using an adjustable barrel nozzle instead of tips, I got to make marks on my calculator. I have to input this data, this nozzle, into this calculator. So it is rated at what? 100. So I set my set the top of my calculator, nozzle pressure at 100. Okay, and my measurements were at 30 gallons a minute. Right, 60, 95, and 10, 25. So what I did is I made marks at those places. It's on that piece that says nozzle bore, but I follow that down and it says, oh, 30 gallons a minute. I'm going to make a mark there. Okay, that's where that nozzle sits within this calculation, and I can then adjust my nozzle pressure and I can come up with what's actually flowing at that setting. Sound good? Haven't lost anybody? All right, so at the 30 gallon a minute setting, that's the first mark I made on the calendar, we had 270 PSI. Oh my God. 220, 40, 60, 80, that's right, 80, 300, so it's about right there. So I set my nozzle pressure at 270. I know you can't see it in the camera, but top arrow goes to 270. I read my residual volume at the first mark I made, which is right next to the 5/16. I get about 50 gallons a minute. So right 50 there. Okay, at the 60 gallon a minute setting, I had 200 PSI. All I do here is I change my arrow, my top arrow, point that at 200. Okay, so there's 200, and read the second mark I made, which is just above the 7/16. So I'm looking at 82.4, 84, we'll call it 84. All right, 95 will be the next mark, and that was 135. So I'm looking at 135, and remember the graduations between different numbers varies. So 135 on the top arrow, and the third mark I made puts me at 110. And then we had 100 PSI at the 125 mark, which means that we're back to where we started, and that mark reads 125. 125, yeah. So that's 125. All right, the weird part here is, there's no weird part. So this pump can produce 50 gallons a minute and still give you 270 PSI. This pump can produce 84 gallons a minute and still give you 200 PSI. Okay, that's easily within any hose lay we'd ever need. At 110 gallons per minute, it's only going to give you 135 PSI. When we start moving 100 gallons a minute, we're running into issues with our hoses, to carry that much. So the fact that it can do it, yeah, great. There might be a place to use that somewhere along the way. However, really the operating range we're looking at is up in here. However, you put all of these into a graph and you have a performance curve. And that performance curve stops at 390 and 0. Okay, these numbers out here on the outside, the settings, they mean nothing now. All they were how we got to these numbers. So there's a performance chart for this specific engine. In theory, these are all standardized and they're all the same, and so the performance chart should be the same. But in practice, this is one of the first evolutions of the national standard, and these things are all over the place. They were built with different components, and some of them have different impellers, so they do not come out the same. We have 4 of them here, and they all come out different. They're close, but they're different. So knowing your specific engine, this is how you can get to know your specific engine. All right, you can run it with the Femper test as well, or with this apparatus, and you can start to fine tune that performance chart even more, because this is all rated at 50, so that 30 gallon a minute setting at 50 is completely different than a 30 gallon a minute setting at 100. It's not completely different, but it is different when you're talking about measuring residual pressure at maximum RPM. So that'll start to narrow things down a little bit more. You can start doing this with tips at different sizes, and really you get down to a 3/16, your standard Forester size, you're not going to get it. We'll probably be fine. So you can add in more measurements to your chart. You can graph your chart, and it'll actually show a physical curve. So that is my pump performance test. There's other pieces to pump performance testing or pump testing that should be included, but I like this one. It gives me a performance curve. The more you're into your engine and know your engine, the more data you'll want in that chart so that you know what you can do. It really comes down to, well, I have a hose lay that demands 50 gallons a minute. I can only build 270 PSI. Is it going to be enough? Or if I have a hose lay that requires 200 PSI, can I give it enough volume? Okay, I think that's it. Any questions? I'm sure somebody will have some.